So please help me to welcome Dr. Kevin McCauley.
Good evening. It's wonderful to be with you. Could I have that a little less hot? Thank you. This is my home, southeastern Pennsylvania. This is where I was born, where I went to medical school, my mother as well. So it's always nice to come back. My family is in the room. The way I kind of try to think about lectures that I do for families, the community, is I try to think about all that has been learned over the 2 decades that I've been trying to study this thing called addiction. And I think about my mother, my own mother, sitting in the family program of the treatment center that I was in, back in 1998. And I asked myself, if I could get into a time machine and transport myself back there, knowing all that we now know, what would I have wanted her to know? What could I have told her that would have made her feel like there was some hope for her son, that this was not her fault? And so that's kind of the way I structure these lectures. How can I use this neuroscience to be immediately helpful to you in understanding what you or your loved one is going through? I went into medicine because I wanted to know things that others didn't. I wanted to be able to use that knowledge to understand people that others didn't. And I have not been disappointed when it comes to addiction medicine. I think the most powerful thing that science can do when it's applied to medicine is make people feel less afraid, less ashamed. And I think that this neuroscience goes a long way to doing that. We now have a very good working model of what makes the brains of people with addiction different. We now have a very good understanding of what lies behind their symptoms. And I have found this information to be very helpful in helping our patients really understand that there are reasons and that there are things that they can do to get better. So I do this lecture 9 times a month for all of our different programs at the place that I work at. The audiences that are the most receptive are our patients. We have a men's center and we have a women's center for people who are suffering with sexual compulsivity and intimacy disorders. Those lectures are some of the most moving that I give. Those people are so ready to hear something that lifts the shame from their shoulders. And I think that this neuroscience can do that. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to kind of dive in. I know that I've got a time frame, so I don't think I'll be able to take questions as we go along. That's the way I like to do it. My parents are also Unitarian, so it's nice to be back in the Unitarian church, so I won't move that. I know what that's for. Let's see. Okay, good. I want also for you to have access to this information. I'm so happy that some of you have watched Pleasure Unwoven. I know it sounds kind of strange. It sounds a little bit like a porn movie. We decided to go with that title because we figured it would kind of get people's attention that way. I am not a filmmaker. I don't know what I'm doing when I make films. It just really frustrates me that there isn't good media out there to deliver, to serve as a conduit for this information to the people who need it. And so I made 2 films. One is about the problem, what goes wrong in the brain, and that's Pleasure Unwoven, and that's what this lecture is kind of an update for. The second one, Memo to Self, was really about the solution. What are the things that we know really predict success in helping people get into long-term recovery? Everyone loves the first film, the first lecture, right? People are excited to hear the science. Everyone loves neuroscience, right? I'm a hero for having, delivered the information. Really, the information is the hero. And they're excited and they're asking questions. And then I usually say, well, now that we've talked about the problem, would you like to talk about the solution? Would you like to talk about what we really know, helps people get into long-term recovery? And no one likes that lecture. All the goodwill that I created with the first lecture, I ended up undoing with the second lecture because it's hard. It's hard to hear. Like any patient who's facing a life-threatening illness, whether it be cancer, heart disease, or addiction, you have to do some things that you don't want to do. And I think that that definitely gets my respect for people who are starting out on this journey. But this is the good stuff, fortunately, and I hope that it will be helpful to you. And I want you to be able to refer back to it. So if you want these slides, I think Kim will have them, but I can provide any of the journal articles. If you need another copy of Pleasure Unwoven, please feel free to write me. They make great coasters. They prop open doors quite nicely, so we've got lots of them lying around. I also have both films on streaming, in streaming form on Vimeo, so I can send you the links to it, and you can watch it as many times as you want if you think that's helpful. And I would love to hear from you, quite frankly. I'm not practicing medicine, so I have time to talk, and I love to talk to family members. I sit by the phone, no one calls me, no one writes me. It's very sad. Right? So I've gotten a lot of mileage out of this joke, which I know many of you have heard. I didn't really, start out with an interest in this. I came through it the other way, which is I became an addict, and I, kind of found myself in the addiction treatment world. What I really wanted to do was fly. I wanted to be a pilot, and since my eyes kept me from being a naval aviator, I was a naval flight surgeon. And I really loved this job, and I wanted to do it for the rest of my life, and then something happened. I had to have a surgery. I'm the first person that I know that became addicted to opioids following a surgery. That now is an extremely common pathway, a superhighway really, into the diagnosis of addiction. And I tried to quit on my own. I think what was so horrifying was how bewildered I was by the fact that I just couldn't stop. I could stop for periods, but I couldn't stay stopped. And I even kind of called the California Medical Board, and they had a little diversion program, and they wanted to send me to the Betty Ford Center, but there really was no way that I could do that because I was in the military, and to say that I had a problem with addiction would mean, or at least not alcohol, not gambling, not food, not cigarettes. Any other addiction was handled through, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And so I tried to kind of get better on my own, and it didn't work. And eventually I got caught, and the Navy sent me to their Betty Ford Center, which is called Leavenworth. And so I found myself in our nation's maximum security military prison pretty quickly. And this is, I think, the one place that we all find ourselves, where you're young or old, whether it's alcohol or some other drug, whether you live today or 100 years ago, we all find ourselves on this square of the Candyland game of life. And we ask, why do I do this? Why would I piss away a great career for a moment's euphoria? And I knew that if they let me out, the first thing I would do would be to get high. And I found that terrifying. I found it horrifying, and I found it fascinating. And I wanted to know, how is this possible? Is addiction really a disease? And so I proceeded to try to learn everything that there was to know about addiction. And I don't know if you've ever been to Leavenworth. It's actually a beautiful base. It's history all around you. It's beautiful fields. It's really kind of a showpiece base for the Army. There's no gate. You can just go in. General Custer was court-martialed in this building. The front door here, the sort of front street, you can't quite see, but there's a bluff right here that goes down to the banks of the Missouri River. And I know this bluff very well because I mowed it quite a bit. If you look at the dirt, you can actually still see the ruts from the Conestoga wagons that were pushed up from the banks of the river, because the front street here is the beginning of the Oregon Trail. So I like to think that I went to the Harvard of prisons. I don't know where you went to prison, but I went to Leavenworth. And so, I was a short-term inmate. I only had a year of confinement. And so very quickly I made minimum custody, and they let me go out the gate every day and join the leaf raking and grass mowing detail. And so I blew grass clippings, basically. This is my trusty machine here, the Toro RD53-6 Mod C. You have to get the Mod C because it has that tapered nozzle, and that's really what you need to get that cyclonic action going, And see, I think it takes a physician, quite frankly, to do this work well, right? Because we have that finesse, right? You give one of these to a sex offender, and they just blow grass clippings all over the place. They don't know what the hell they're doing, right? But a doctor, we have an understanding that you have to create this cushion of air, so it lifts, and it moves, and it drops, and it lifts, and it moves, and... All right, this is probably a conversation for another time. So I don't want to say that I thrived in prison, but it was a structured environment, and gave me 10.5 months of healing before I went to treatment, brain healing, and then the Navy paid for all of my treatment, for which I'm eternally grateful. So I kind of, I sort of approached this problem of prison sort of like I did, when I was a pre-med student. Let's just study our way out of it. All right, I'm an inmate. I find myself in prison. What do I need to do to be a good inmate? What should I be reading? You told me to blow leaves, so I tried to become an expert on leaves. And in the process of all that studying came this lecture. This is actually a picture of Alcatraz, but it looked almost exactly like that. And I really wanted to know the answer to this question. Is this really a disease? I believe that the answer to this question is yes. I meet lots of people who have very solid recovery who do not believe that they have a disease. I want to make room for those people in the big tent of recovery as well. So I'm not an evangelist for the disease model quite the way I was even 10 years ago, but I do think that it's therapeutic for people who are in treatment to think about it. Which side are you on? Why do you feel this way or that way? And I think that that's what this neuroscience can do. The best definition of, if you want a quick and dirty definition of addiction, go to the ASAM definition. I would be glad to send this to you. This is an 8-page document that was published in 2011. It's an excellent summation of the neuroscience as we know it. And one of the things that they wanted to point out is that it's primary. It can exist with other mental health disorders, right? But it doesn't need to, right? It can be primary on its own. And trying to parse out what is the dysthymia of being a person in early recovery and what is actually major depressive disorder, that's part of the work that needs to be done in the first few years of recovery. ASAM has their definition of symptoms. DSM has a definition too. In many ways, ASAM was trying to publish this before the DSM-5 came out. They wanted to get the drop on the APA, and they did. But I don't really see much difference between the DSM definition, the 11 symptoms of, is it 11? No, it's 11 symptoms, and what ASAM uses. I think what's most important to understand about addiction is that it starts out as a disorder in the hedonic system in the brain, specifically the dopamine system. So the next time you have a pleasurable experience, right, you take a piece of chocolate cake and you put it into your mouth and you say, what do you say? You say, yum. Stop yourself in that moment and ask, how is my brain doing this? How is it constructing this pleasurable experience? And let's load it up. Let's say it's not just any piece of chocolate cake. Let's make it grandma's chocolate cake. You know the cake I'm talking about. I don't know what grandma puts in it, but nobody likes cake like grandma. And she's been making it our whole lives, and we've been eating it, and we love grandma, and she's dead now, and we miss her, but we still have her cake recipe, all right? So you take that yum and load it up with all that semantic content, all that motion and memory, right? This is the way the brain constructs a hedonic experience. And that is what it uses to make choices, right? So if you break the hedonic system, the next system to go is the system that allows us to make choices, the volitional system in the brain. So what the brain does is when it comes across something that is good for survival, right, it immediately attaches pleasure to it because it wants us to continue to do that thing. And so this process starts very, very deep in the brain in this rather ancient survival engine called the midbrain. And this is where early reward processing begins. It's not conscious yet, it's just the earliest first piece of processing of the pleasurable experience. And I use the term engine because this thing is extremely good at keeping the organism that possesses it alive. It is very well designed over millions of years. It actually existed long before humans did, right? And so this is one reason why we can learn about human midbrains from studying animal midbrains, because it's really kind of the same thing at this level of brain processing. And when it kicks in, it's very powerful. And it can tell the difference in the environment between things that are good for survival and things that are not so good for survival. I'll give you an example. Let's say we're in a survival situation. Let's say we are on a desert island, and we're shipwrecked, and we walk around it, and in 15 minutes we know every rock, and there's no food. Within about a day or two, this survival engine is going to start to kick in. Now let's say we get lucky, and a container washes up on the beach. What do you want to be in that container? Do you want it to be a container full of broccoli, or do you want it to be a container full of chocolate cupcakes? I will give you the correct answer. It's the cupcakes, all right? Broccoli will do you no good, literally zero good in this situation. Yes, cruciferous vegetables are supposed to lower colon cancer risk, and that's all very good, but that's not the time frame on which the midbrain works. And so it tends to give more hedonic weight to the thing that is better for survival. You will die just as quickly with or without broccoli. Chocolate cupcakes will keep you alive for quite a while, right? And so we tend to give more hedonic. Most people find chocolate cupcakes more pleasurable than broccoli. Now, I cannot tell you the arguments that I get with this. People say, well, I don't think that's true. I don't think chocolate cupcakes taste better than broccoli. I think broccoli tastes better. Well, that's because you've got a really good frontal cortex, right? And you've created a metaphor out of broccoli about health and longevity. So yes, the frontal cortex can overcome, but that's not its default. That's not the midbrain's default. And this is one reason why dogs don't steal broccoli. They steal chocolate cupcakes. And so this is where things start to go wrong in addiction, right? So I think that's an important sentence to know. I think there are 3 important sentences to know about addiction, and I would make that the first one, is that addiction is basically a broken pleasure sense. And everything bad then comes from that disorder very, very deep in the brain. The next thing that the brain does when it comes across something that is good for survival and it attaches pleasure to it, right, is it lays down a memory of that thing. And not just the thing that is good for survival, not just the cake, but everything that goes along with it. The people that I was with, the sights and smells of that moment, even the time of day becomes part of that memory, and those things now will serve as cues to predict the imminent delivery of the thing that's good for survival, which in this case is the cake, right? So perhaps you can see what's gone wrong here. In addiction, there's a defect in the reward learning system in the brain. And the value that is given to the drug is way out of proportion to its actual survival value. So there's a valuation problem, and the learning that occurs of the drug and everything that goes along with it is really a hyper-learning. It is a pathological form of memory. And so not only is the drug remembered, but everything that goes along with it, the people that I was with, the sights and smells, even the angle of the sun in the sky becomes part of that memory. And this person is now going to be ruled by that problem in the reward learning system. So the next system to come online is the memory and learning system. So addiction is a disorder not just in reward, but also in memory and learning. The next system to come online is the system that pushes back against hunger, and that's the stress system, right? And so this is the entry for what I think is the 3rd most important sentence about addiction. I'll get to it, right? And as you see what happens, we're just kind of climbing levels of brain processing, one after the other, and they're all interacting. There's signals going in both directions, right? But by the time we get into the frontal cortex, which is where we have higher emotions, where we give things their semantic content, where we make choices based on all of that, right? That choice is dependent upon processing that has come before it, right? And so by the time we're in the frontal cortex, the processing up here is only as good as the quality of the processing that's arriving from below, right? And what happens in addiction is that this process unravels. And what unravels with it is a capacity that we take for granted, and that is our capacity to make choices. So addiction starts out as a disorder of pleasure and very quickly becomes a volitional disorder, and that is a very, very big idea indeed. The idea that free will, agency, choice, whatever you want to call it, can become part of a disease process is not something that goes down well. I think it especially is hard for Americans because we tend to fetishize choice. We print words like liberty on our money. So it strikes me as particularly apt that the United States would have 2+ million people in prison, most of those people who were there because they had a volitional disorder, right? And I think that's what this neuroscience gives us, the ability to have a more nuanced and I think more realistic understanding of what actually goes into a choice, right? I want to know, how does choice actually work? And this is the way the brain kind of constructs a volitional act, right? So The third sentence that I referred to is really what causes all of this, what sets all of this in motion. And genes are important, don't get me wrong, but genes are not the cause of addiction. They can get you to addiction faster. They're a vulnerability or a resilience factor, but the thing that actually breaks the dopamine system in the early hedonic processing and sets all of this in motion is chronic, severe, repetitive, especially early in life and even inherited stress. The dopamine system is extremely fragile to stress, especially early stress. And this is what allows us to bring in our brothers and sisters with trauma-related disorders, PTSD. It's what allows us to understand the anhedonia component of major depressive disorder. It's what allows us to understand a very frequently comorbid disorder. Maybe even this disorder is actually a premorbid state for adult addiction, and that is childhood ADHD. Childhood ADHD and adult addiction are both disorders in dopamine receptors, right? And so this is what I think kind of brings all of these things together, but what I think is important to understand is that we have multiple systems in the brain that are failing at the same time. It's not just this area or that area. There are at least 5 different areas that we know of. And again, the symptoms that I would list for addiction are loss of control. That's one of the things I'm looking for, right? The person has tried mightily to corral their drug use. It always seems to get away from them. Anyone who tells me that they can save cocaine, yeah, that person is not an addict. Oh yeah, I had an 8-ball and I used a little bit and I put the rest away for later. Yeah, that's not addiction, right? It's gone in a flash and then you gotta get more, right? The second one is the symptom that gets everybody around the person, what matters the most to the people around the person with addiction, and that is that phenomenon of persistent drug use despite negative consequences. This is the symptom that's at the heart of the question that people ask about addiction, which is, why don't they stop? If they knew what they could lose, if they knew what they were risking, why won't they stop, right? It's because something has gone wrong in the value calculation part of the brain. And the value that has been given to the drug is not normal value. It is very deep survival value, right? And so I think it's important to state that alcohol for the alcoholic is no longer just alcohol. It is life itself. And there's no consequence, there's no punishment that you can bring to bear on that faulty decision-making that will work, because nothing is higher than actual survival, right? Relapse, not everyone relapses. Some people get sober and they don't relapse, but this seems to be a feature, and it's part of what defines the chronicity of addiction. And then this phenomenon of craving, which is the symptom that matters the most to the person with addiction. And craving is difficult to describe. Lots of people have tried to put it into words. I can give it a shot, right? I'm sure I'll fail, but here goes. Craving is not something like, gee, I really want drugs a lot. Craving is up in the middle of the night, can't sleep, sweat on your brow, pulse at 120, thinking over and over and over again, just one more time. Just one more time, I want to feel the burn of that alcohol as it goes down my throat. Just one more time, I want to feel the heat of that glass pipe against my lips. Just one more time, I want to hear the clickety-clack of those pills in the bottle. I want to see the swirl of blood in that syringe. What William Burroughs called the beautiful rose, just before I push down the plunger and every cell in my body says, thank you. That's craving. And make no mistake, that is genuine suffering. If what I just said, that stupid little soliloquy, doesn't make any sense to you, good. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. If I were to go to the local detox and do that stupid little soliloquy, the needle addicts will fall out of their chairs. It is a very deep, emotional, aversive, and most importantly, involuntary brain state. And I think that it's the presence of craving that ultimately defeats the argument against addiction being a disease, what I call the choice argument, which is addiction's not a disease. People can stop anytime they want. For instance, if you put a bottle of alcohol in front of the alcoholic and they reach for it, right, because they say they're powerless, but if they reach for it and you pull out a gun and you point it at their head and say, okay, how about now, Mr. Alcoholic? They can, in that moment, faced with that consequence, I don't know how you'd turn that into policy, but let's just use it as a thought experiment, right? They can summon the free will to choose not to drink, and that's why addiction's not a disease. Yes, if you put drugs in front of me and a gun to my head, I can choose not to use, but I can't choose not to crave. And it's really the craving that is the more important measure of addiction. And then this brain state where people have this very, very faulty decision-making, plus, and I think this is the cruelty of addiction, not only is their decision-making terrible, but they can't see it. As part of the disease process, they lose insight into just how impaired they are. It's possible that these two are actually the same thing. They're really just a brain state that a person enters. They're not in it all the time. They kind of go in and out. Sometimes it's really bad, sometimes it's not so bad. And that brain state is where most of the damage is done, certainly to the relationships in their life. Right? So let's pull these symptoms apart. Let's try to pull all of this apart. One of the first things that I have to do with our patients who come to our treatment center is I've got to address the family history thing. I got to take on the genetic thing, because a lot of our people, our parents, they feel terribly guilty having to come to treatment. They're very, very worried that they have passed their addiction on to their beloved child, right? So there's no denying it. Addiction is a genetic disorder. We know that the heritability of addiction, is about 1/2 to 2/3, and that seems to hold roughly throughout the drugs, and even for one behavior, all right? So at least half, probably as many as 2/3 or 3/4 of the vulnerability to addiction is purely genetic. Now, it's important to really define what heritability means. It doesn't mean that if I have a mom or a dad or a grandparent with alcoholism, that I've got a 1 in 2 to 2 in 3 chance of becoming an alcoholic. That is not what heritability means, right? What it means is that if I become an alcoholic, then 1/2 to 2/3 of the vulnerability, the explanation for it, can be located in my genes alone. And so these are all statements about risk, right? They are not statements about what will happen. They are not statements of determinism. And so this gives me a little ledge to stand on. If I have the genes for alcoholism, and I become an alcoholic, and I die, that is not so good. But if I have the genes for alcoholism, and I become an alcoholic, and I recover, that is very, very, very good, because that is an adaptation. Biology loves adaptations, right? And so I try to at least open the door to this possibility that as ashamed as they feel now in treatment, as angry as their family is at them now, the day will come for every single one of our patients where one of their family members or coworkers or friends reaches out to them and says, I know we've had our differences in the past, but I know that you went through this, and I know that you got sober. We just got a call from our kid's school. He's been kicked out for drugs. Can I ask you some questions? And that's the point at which that person has converted that vulnerability into resilience, and not just for them, but for their family and their community and maybe even their nation, right? I cannot have our patients seek refuge in genetic determinism. Well, it's in my genes. Why bother getting sober? I got to block that chess move, right? And we can go, I don't really go into this very deeply, but there are a number of changes that have been observed. In fact, there are many of these polymorphisms, these differences. One of the first that was discovered was found by Kenneth Blum, right? It was an allele of this particular gene, and for these people who had this allele in the gene for, one of the genes for the gene for one of the receptors of dopamine, they seem to have a kind of a spectrum of disorders that involve not just alcoholism addiction, but also things like ADHD, right? So something is wrong with the dopamine receptor. This is just one of the genetic differences, right? And so these people are what Dr. Blum says are a little reward deficient. They have reward deficiency syndrome. They're not quite getting the hedonic response that the rest of us get when we do something pleasurable, right? I call these people 2-stick of chewing gum people, right? Because usually you offer someone a stick of gum and they take 1 piece, right? These people have to take 2 or more, right? Because they're trying to get into normal hedonic territory. So they always overdrink, they always overeat trying to get into there, right? The other thing is that their decision-making is different, right? They tend to prefer immediate rewards that really aren't all that great over the long run, over rewards that are much better over the long run, but delayed. In other words, they have that feature that we all have, delayed discounting, but they have it much, much worse. And this dooms them to a life of poor financial planning, drug use, alcoholism, quitting jobs, based on some slight that may or may not have existed, and really, social cognition deficits that cause them problems in their family life and in their relationships at work and with other friends, right? And so that is just one of the polymorphisms that can lead to this syndrome, right? Where things get interesting is when you look not at the genetics of addiction, but at the epigenetics of addiction. Now, this is a field I understand imperfectly, I will admit, but essentially, epigenetics is a way for a short-term heredity mechanism to exist. If a person is under some kind of survival threat, that changes not their DNA, but the packaging of their DNA, whether their DNA or a particular gene is turned on or off, right? And that is, some of these epigenetic changes happen and they're gone within, a few weeks. Some of them are actually so robust that they can be transmitted from one generation to another. And the study that really began this whole field was the Överkalix study. Överkalix is a tiny town in the northern part of Sweden that has exquisite records, and when the geneticist or when the epidemiologist looked at these records, what they noticed is that if a young boy was exposed to the stressor of food scarcity at this particular window of development, the rate of diabetes went down, not in him, not in his son, but in his grandson. For a young woman who was similarly exposed, and again, had that window of development, the rate of diabetes went up, not in her daughter, but in her granddaughter. So the sexist difference notwithstanding, what these studies showed is that some of these stressors faced by one generation could have transgenerational influences on disease expression. That is a very, very big idea, and it goes a long way to explaining some of the other phenomenon that we've noticed, like for instance, well, I won't go further. Why is it that the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors have a higher rate of PTSD when they're so distal from the initial threat? So the statement, trauma is heritable, is I think one that we can take to the bank. It's not changing the DNA itself, it's creating these little epigenetic changes, a little attachment of methyl groups or acetyl groups that turn genes on or turn them off or change the way they're wrapped so that the gene is exposed when it shouldn't be, right? And that can make the difference between disease and no disease. And these are heritable. Now I'm really in the fire with our patients, right? Because I'm basically saying all the drug use that you engaged in, it's still there and you can pass it on to your kid. I gotta pull myself out of this. Here's the good news. These epigenetic changes can go in the bad direction, but they can also go in the good direction. And that's important because it gives us a way of understanding the heritability, not just of addiction, but of recovery, right? I think it also points out a few things that we may not have realized that now we're starting to realize are much more serious than we realized they were. This is Denise and Eric Kandel. Eric Kandel is the world's expert on learning and memory. He's a Nobel Prize winner. What a lot of people don't know about Eric Kandel is that his wife is just as accomplished a researcher. And she's been, throughout her life, doing her research on the gateway drug hypothesis. And what she would say is that it really doesn't apply as much to marijuana as social conservatives would hope. It applies very well, however, to nicotine. And what she found is that when a person smokes a cigarette, it acetylates a very particular locus on a particular chromosome, and for the next 7 days, should that person use cocaine, they're much more likely to become addicted to it. And so the statement that nicotine primes cocaine addiction is another one that we can take to the bank. It doesn't seem to work in the opposite direction. Using cocaine doesn't necessarily make you more likely to become a smoker. But exposure to nicotine matters. And it matters especially when you're talking about younger and younger people exposed to higher and higher doses of nicotine through these vaping products, right? Don't ever, ever believe that a nicotine manufacturer has any public health interest at all in the people that are buying their product. I don't know if you read that New York Times article about two weeks ago about how vaping was rolled out. Yeah, this was always the stealth thing. Oh, it's going to help people quit. What we're really finding is that people are using them at the same time, right? Maybe electronic cigarettes could have been used as a nicotine cessation device. It doesn't, when you have a nicotine cessation device, it doesn't look like the marketing that you're seeing for all of these things like Juuls, right? This is a big problem, and we are going to be picking apart the epigenetic damage that nicotine has done to these young people for a long, long time. So, that's genetics. Isn't that fun, right? I try to end on a high note or a positive note with that, right? But for you, we'll go a little further. One of the things that I really have to do also is I have to hold below the waterline that idea that my smoking helps me stay sober. That is dead, dead wrong, and I'll show you why. When we look at this symptom, which is really the symptom that upsets everybody around the person with addiction, we have to go back to that area in the brain that processes reward at the very earliest levels, right? At the core of all pleasurable experiences is the release of this chemical that we all have heard of called dopamine, right? And so these pathways, these areas of the midbrain that send pathways, dopaminergic pathways, up to the frontal cortex and to the striatum, specifically this area called the nucleus accumbens, they are what begin that process when the brain generates a pleasurable experience. Excuse me. So dopamine is the first in several chemicals that the brain is going to use to create that pleasurable experience. It's wrong to say that dopamine is the love chemical or the pleasure chemical because it just handles this one component of pleasure, which is reward salience, right? Dopamine also codes for prediction error. So if I think something's going to be pretty good, and then when I do it, it's better than expected, that's an important moment for the reward learning system, and that's what dopamine codes for. And this research was done, oops, let me go a little further by Kent Berridge at the University of Michigan. What he was able to do is figure out when mice liked something or didn't like something. Apparently there is this universal facial expression. When something likes something, it sticks its tongue out, and that's true for mice and babies. If it doesn't like it, it makes this kind of O sign. Okay, fine, who am I to question science, right? But what he found is that mice that were hyperdopaminergic, they had too much dopamine, it's not necessarily that they enjoyed cheese more, they were simply faster through a maze to get it. They were more likely to get around obstacles to get it. And he was the one who coined this idea that dopamine is not about liking because pleasure involves a whole bunch of chemicals, not just dopamine and then the second chemical, glutamate, right? This is what we consider consummatory pleasure. What dopamine handles is wanting. It is pure crystalline desire. And the two drugs that release the most dopamine are cocaine and amphetamines. And this is why you often hear those folks say, I'm not really getting high anymore, but it's the getting of the drug. It's the wanting of the drug. I'm driving home with the 8-ball in my pocket, and I'm already high, right? Because that anticipatory pleasure, even of things that are not pleasurable, like stress, right, that's handled by dopamine. And so what all intoxicants do is they create these supraphysiologic releases of dopamine along this pathway. That is not what the brain was meant to handle. It was meant to handle normal pleasures, but what drugs do is they create these massive surges of dopamine, and so every time a person smokes crystal or crack, they're essentially getting a message that kind of goes like this: hold the phone, man. This is way better than expected, even though the drug is not really better than expected. This is really good for survival, even though the drug is actually quite harmful. This is better than anything in the past for survival. Put this higher on the survival priority list, even though the drug should not have that value. And with each surge of dopamine, the drug just goes higher and higher and higher in its value until it's equated with survival, and there's nothing that can compete with that. I spend a lot of time trying to explain to people that you cannot punish your way out of addiction. You cannot bring a consequence to the table and have that stop a person from using drugs. People will often say that it was the threat of the punishment that got me to stop. Then how is it possible that we can have a symptom like persistent use despite negative consequences? I think they very often credit the punishment when really it was something else, like the sober peers in their life, the fact that they had safe housing, the fact that they had treatment for their mental illness, the fact that they had a future. I would say when I woke up this morning, about 60% of what was keeping me sober was the punishment. I don't want to go back to Leavenworth. What makes me interesting as a person with a dopamine disorder is that the punishment doesn't have 100% deterrence. In a normal person, it does. That person gets a DUI and it deters any further drug use. But what makes people with addiction so interesting is that it only works to a point. And then you're going to have something to cover that extra area And in the culture of recovery that I grew up in, that is the daily maintenance of a spiritual condition. That's what covers me for that extra part that the punishment won't cover. Okay. The other person that did this research was Nora Volkoff, the head of NIDA, right? And she was really the one that showed that it wasn't just the dopamine release, it was the rate of dopamine release. So it's really, how fast the dopamine comes on that's important. And the fastest way to get any drug into your brain is to smoke it, even faster than injecting, right? Because if I inject a drug, it has to go to my heart, then to my lungs, then back to my heart, and then finally to my brain. It's an eternity, 12 to 15 seconds, right? But if I smoke a drug, it's lungs, heart, brain, 3 to 5 seconds. And that difference in the kinetics means everything. And so the drugs that release the most dopamine, the fastest, are probably smoked cocaine and methamphetamine. That's why they have such famous craving profiles and addiction profiles, right? Other drugs release dopamine, but not necessarily at that same rate, okay? What Dr. Volkoff also found was that what made the brains of people with addiction different is that they had too few of these dopamine D2 receptors relative to normal people. So this could be another feature or another way of understanding Kenneth Blum's reward deficiency syndrome. But what Dr. Volkoff was trying to point out is it's the population of these dopamine receptors that drives proper signaling up to the frontal cortex. The processing up here is only as good as the quality of the processing arriving there. And in people who have plenty of these dopamine receptors, their frontal cortex seems to work well, their decision-making is better, their self-awareness is better. If you start to lose those dopamine receptors, then those faculties start to lose them. The whole point of recovery is to try to take out the intoxication, right? Remove that spike, and then stay up here and allow that signaling to improve, and then the person's decision-making and their social cognition improve as well. So I think, this is the one merciful thing that nature gave us was this rather elegant hypothesis that what binds all intoxicants together is their ability to release dopamine. And there are immediately some things we can take away from this, and one of them is, if I got a problem with one, I have a liability to develop a problem in any of them. And this is why we often see people move from one intoxicant to another. You probably are familiar with the first study that showed that those states that have legalized marijuana for recreational use have lower opioid overdose death rates. That was true up until 2008. If you take in the data after that, the benefit was removed, right? But that's not, you don't hear often the second part of this story, right? So if a person moves from heroin to pot, have they made some improvements? Of course they have, right? They've taken lethality pretty much off the table, right? So from a pure harm reduction perspective, from a pure public health perspective, that would be good if everyone who was using heroin moved over to to cannabinoids. The problem is the intoxication is still in the picture. You still have that dopamine release, and that means that those receptors are probably not going to come back as quickly as they can, and the person is extremely high risk of going back to the original dopamine releaser. The dopamine hypothesis also shows why continued nicotine use is not a benefit to the person's recovery, that it puts them at high risk for relapse. If a person is able to quit smoking in their first year after treatment, they're more likely to be sober from their primary intoxicant 9 years later. So taking care of the dopamine system, not overdriving it, is important. And I think the other thing that's powerful about the dopamine hypothesis is that it shows us that it's not just chemicals that do this. There are people who can take normal pleasures and manipulate them, sometimes ritually, to get the same kinds of dopamine releases as the people on this side of the list, right? And so this helps us understand how a person can have a chemical addiction, a substance use disorder, right? So you can see that, so the idea is that we're not supposed to use the word addiction anymore because it's too, stigmatizing. Okay, great, I get it. If you really look up the word addiction in the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll find that it's actually a fascinating word that has moved and changed in its definition throughout history. Originally, it was a Roman legal term to describe the process of binding over a slave to a new owner. Well, that's very descriptive, I think, of the process of addiction. And over the next 2,000 years, it evolved as a word to mean fealty and loyalty, and then finally into the definition that we use today. Too stigmatizing? Okay. But when the DSM-5 chose substance use disorder, right, it implied that, substances are all that could create addiction. So even that term is difficult. I think we should go back to addiction, quite frankly. I think that word describes the situation quite well, right? But if I'm treating a person with cocaine or methamphetamine addiction and I don't recognize the sexual compulsivity component of that, it will look like the addiction has stopped when really it's just moved to a more subclinical phase or phenomenon, right? So, I was trying to find a way to make this part of the lecture go a little faster, and my mother's a fly fisher woman, and she bought me this shirt before we went to Montana to go fly fishing, and I don't fly fish, so I was just sitting there kind of doing things, and I said, hey, looking at this shirt, we should actually come up with our own periodic table of the intoxicants. So I did. There they are. These are all the intoxicants that you're likely to see in the United States. I change this every few years, so if you have a good one, please let me know. I'll put a box up there for it, right? I'll be honest with you, I don't know how much crocodile we're really seeing in the ERs of Phoenix. This is this terrible, awful drug that they use in Russia, which is hands down the worst country for addiction. You essentially make it in your kitchen out of codeine, and if you miss the vein, it's going to create this terrible necrotizing fasciitis that makes you look like a crocodile. Why would anyone use that when you've got all this high-grade heroin coming up from the border? But so many people were asking me about crocodile, right, that I had to stick it in there, right? So the green ones are the opiates and opioids. I got a lot of questions about kratom, so I put mitragynine in there, right? As you go from left to right, basically the drugs either become more potent or stronger agonists or a greater affinity at the receptor that they bind to, or more likable. When I put carfentanil on this list, I never in a million years thought that I would be talking about carfentanil in the context of human use. But this is a rule about addiction. It never stays where you think it's going to. It will always get away from you. If you legalize marijuana, in your mind, you're thinking about the slobbery joint that you and I passed around in high school, right? But it doesn't stay there. People use technology and they essentially create a super intoxicant out of the intoxicant that was thought to be innocuous, right? But this is sort of a little shorthand that I use to remind myself, yeah, I might have had an alcohol problem or a cocaine or a Demerol problem at one or another time, but really deep down, I've got a dopamine problem. And I need to hear that. And I need to be careful about things that release dopamine, right? I think the dopamine hypothesis, when do I stop, Kim? 15 minutes? Okay, good. I think the dopamine hypothesis also goes a long way to explaining one of the pieces of research that's often used to undermine the idea that addiction's a disease, and I'm specifically talking about the Rat Park study by Bruce Alexander, all right? This is a study that was done by this Canadian. He was never able to fully replicate it, and so it was a little bit of a dead end, but it is constantly quoted in popular, media pieces about addiction, especially on TED, right? And so what he did, Dr. Alexander, is he essentially had two groups of rats. One was housed in isolation in a Skinner box, and they basically were allowed to press a lever for morphine, right? And of course, they all became addicted very quickly. The other group was allowed to live in a cage with nice shavings and toys and good food and other rats to play with. And when I say play, I don't mean checkers, right? And what he noticed is that these rats didn't become addicted. And so he made a statement that I think is actually quite true. Housing matters, right? And those rats that were socially housed, they seem to have more resilience against morphine addiction. In fact, if you took the addicted rats and put them into Rat Park, they stopped using heroin. The question is, how do you know that they didn't move over to another intoxicant, right? There are too many confounders in there because dopamine involves too many other chemicals, right? And so the statement often made is that it's not the drugs that create addiction, it's entirely the environment. And that, I believe, is a step towards, well, if it's not the drugs, then let's legalize drugs. Why do we have drug laws, right? Because it's not the drugs that create addiction at all. Trust me, when you're talking about drugs like fentanyl, it's the drugs, right? They're toxins, and they are very, very poisonous. And so I think we really have to kind of use the dopamine hypothesis to explain things like this. The other thing that we have to do is we have to read the study. And if you actually read the Alexander study, you'll find that both groups drank plenty of morphine, all right? It wasn't like one drank morphine and one never touched it. In fact, by number, there were more deaths in the socially housed group. So this is why this study is just not a good study. It gets people's attention, right? I think it's found a phenomenon about addiction, but it hasn't been able to explain that phenomenon, and that's why the study really was kind of a dead end. But you will hear it over and over and over again. Be careful. I would like to say, though, I think the point is made. Housing matters. Housing is such a powerful healthcare determinant that if you have safe, sober housing, everything else works better. AA works better, buprenorphine works better, cognitive behavioral therapy works better, it all works better. Without safe, sober housing, none of it works very well. And so if I had $1 to spend, before I put it in the basket, although I would go to the meeting, before I spent it on Suboxone, I would spend it on housing. That is, I think, the most important thing to secure first, and everything follows from that. Okay. So this is one of the people that is kind of a gadfly, Dr. Nutt in England. He's a very, very interesting guy. He was the one who published this very interesting chart that tries to rank dependence, likelihood of dependence, and physical harm. And so he was kind of the drug czar in the UK, and this chart got him fired, right? He was trying to essentially create a mindful understanding of where really the risk is, and I think that that was a good thing. You know, part of what got him into trouble is that he put ecstasy a little too far down on the physical harm. I think that's actually a very, very harmful drug for some people. But you know, you can't exactly fault him for trying to at least bring some logic and data to some of our thoughts about drugs. And he's published a number of studies that kind of question the role of dopamine and its part in drug high, right? It's definitely true that stimulants release a lot of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, but other drugs less so, and some drugs there's no evidence that they do it at all. In fact, in this one study, heroin had no effect on striatal dopamine, and Nora Volkoff recently published a paper that said that caffeine doesn't increase dopamine, it decreases dopamine, and no one's really quite sure what to make of that. So it's definitely complex. I want to put this research up here to kind of show you that the dopamine hypothesis is a solid hypothesis. These are important studies, but they're just a handful. But we may, you know, be thinking a little bit more about dopamine and exactly how it, the role that it plays. But I think it goes a long way to explaining the dynamics that we see in treatment. I went up to Mark Gold, who's also a very famous researcher when it comes to cocaine and dopamine. He has a very, very good site. Mark Gold's website is a great way to stay up on the latest research. And I went up to him and I said, "Did you see Dr. Volkoff's study about caffeine?" And he said, "Of course Nora's going to publish that study. That's her drug of choice," right? Now, I don't know if I'm that cynical, right? But it's complex, and caffeine is especially complex when it comes to how it behaves as an intoxicant, if it does. Relapse is something else that we need to explain. If you look at the ASAM definition, there are 3 things that predict relapse. One is any re-exposure to the drug, and really that's any re-exposure to things that cause large amounts of dopamine release. So really, any exposure to big dopamine can cause relapse. Exposure to things that went along with the drug can cause relapse, and that's mediated by the chemical that comes right after dopamine, glutamate, all right? So now we're in the memory learning parts of the brain. I think it's a good thing. Maia Slavitz is a very fine writer who's written a book. It's #1 on Amazon, and it's a great book. I love it. And she makes the comment that addiction's not a disease, that it's more of a learning disorder, right? First of all, the first thing I would like to know is what's so special about learning that it can't become part of a disease process, right? It absolutely can. And I think that, you know, this is an important statement, and if addiction only involved the learning and memory system, then I think that it would be a true statement, but it doesn't. It involves a lot of systems, but we need to take this into account if we want to understand addiction. So now we're talking about areas that are important in memory, right, and conditioning, right? So we're talking about the hippocampus, we're talking about the amygdala. Amygdala gives the first kind of coding of emotion to the dopamine signal as it goes up. I think of it as a spray can on that signal, and then it hands it on up to higher areas of the brain, right? And we have to think not just about areas of the brain, but really the way they communicate, the connections between them. And there is a way to measure those connections, the actual wiring between these areas. It's a form of magnetic resonance imaging called diffusion tensor imaging. Diffusion tensor imaging measures water molecules, like all MR does, but it measures the movement of water molecules through the brain. And you can get these rather beautiful pictures of not the gray matter, but the white matter, the actual wiring. This is a picture of the I-405 in Los Angeles at night. What you're looking at are cars coming towards you and cars going away from you. And the reason that they're moving in a line is because of the physical structure of the Interstate 405. That's what DTI does with water molecules. And it's what can give you these extremely artful pictures of the actual wiring. And so the goal is to try to come up with an understanding of the human connectome. What is the basic wiring diagram for all humans? If we scan 1 million or more brains and we come up with that basic wiring diagram, then we can scan this brain and compare them. And if there's a difference, that might be a good way of defining pathology. And this is purported to be PTSD. There's way too much signaling going through the amygdala on up to the frontal cortex. There should be some, but not that much, right? And so this may be the way that we actually are able to define quantitatively what addiction is with these neuroimaging studies. And then the good news is that we can engage that person in treatment and watch the connections change because they're actually quite plastic. And so just because that's there now doesn't mean we can't engage in therapy and rewire the brain. And those connections that support addiction that are used less and less as the person gets deeper and deeper into their sobriety, they will weaken and other sobriety-based pathways will take over, right? So like I said, the chemical that comes right next on this dopamine, or on this reward cascade is glutamate. And so glutamate follows dopamine and it essentially lays down a memory, okay, of whatever released the dopamine. With drugs, the release of dopamine is so great that the response from the glutamate system is equally great. And so these are not just normal memories. These are memories about the drug that are burned into the brain. And if they're activated, if I come across a person that I used to use drugs with, or a time of day, or even an exit on a freeway, that can cause glutamate release and initiate drug seeking. Glutamate is also a chemical. Did I put this slide in here? Glutamate is the chemical that the frontal cortex uses to control the dopamine areas of the brain. And what happens is the dopamine signal, which is primarily a go signal, becomes too strong, and the glutamate stop signal becomes weaker and weaker and weaker. So you have this combination of behavioral impulsivity, whatever pops into the person's mind they act on, combined with a failure of behavioral inhibition. And that's what can cause these very powerful and very reflexive and not entirely conscious relapses based on cues, right? So Peter Kalivas at the Medical University of South Carolina has done this research. He says that there's so much glutamate that it actually spills out of the synapse and it starts binding to extrasynaptic receptors, and that's what provides these pathologic connections, this pathologic form of memory. And you can actually see these memories form. When the brain learns something, it creates these little dendritic spines that are trying to make connections with other neurons, right? So when we learn the alphabet, this is what happened. When we use drugs, this is what happened. And there is something left over, this transcription factor, that tells you that this happened, even if you can't measure the synaptic, the dendritic spines in real time, right? I kind of think of delta phos-B as sort of being the stuff that's left over after you build an IKEA bookcase, right? If you go over to your friend's house and you see the cardboard and the Swedish directions and all that, you may not see the bookcase, but you know that they built one, right? And so if there's too much of this, that's a signal that maybe the learning was a pathologically strong form of learning. And in cocaine addicts, there seems to be way too much of this, and that's been thought of as perhaps a biomarker to measure addiction. I think what's important to understand here is that this is a pathologic form of memory. I'm going to skip that, right? Loss of control, this is, I think, what brings the stress system into this. That's the third cause of relapse, right? And so we're now kind of sort of one floor up even more, okay? And most of this research on the connection between stress and addiction has been done by George Koob in San Diego. And he doesn't call the stress system. He calls it the anti-reward system, because the stress system and the hedonic system work opposite each other. They push each other back and forth, right? Most people noticed that if you give a reinforcer to a laboratory animal, over time, it uses more and more and more. And what that implies is that something is pushing back against the intoxication. That's the stress system, right? And so normally, when the stress system gets activated, it releases this chemical, CRF, CRH. It goes only a few millimeters to the pituitaries, which release adrenocorticotropic hormone, which go into the bloodstream and aim for the adrenal glands, which sit like little yarmulkes on the top of your kidneys. And they release a host of chemicals that go out to the body and get it ready to deal with stress. They liberate glucose stores, they open up pupils, they open up airways, they get you ready to deal with it, and then when you've dealt with it, the system feeds back on itself to shut itself off. This is the way the system is designed to operate. It turns on, it turns off. Unfortunately, when people are exposed to chronic stress, it never gets a chance to turn off, and one of the stressors that's out there that people are exposed to is intoxication itself, right? So essentially, when I go on a drinking binge, well, let's see if this will work. Yeah, I release a huge amount of dopamine, and my brain tries to restore homeostasis by pushing back with CRF. If it's just one drinking binge, okay, no harm, no foul. But if I'm getting drunk every day, then the system never really gets a chance to turn off, and eventually it just gets stuck. And that's what starts to cause damage to the body. Not only that, the system has what's called hysteresis. It has a form of memory. Once it's been overdriven, that cumulative stress becomes part of the way it operates. So it's now going to over-operate. It's kind of like a Slinky. Did you ever have a Slinky when you were a kid? And when you took it out of the box, it was beautiful, and it walked downstairs and all that crap, right? And then you overstretched it, and it never quite goes back. Well, that's essentially what happens to the stress system. Once it's overdriven and overdriven and overdriven, that forms a kind of memory, and now it's always going to be too responsive, right? And so over time, the stress system gets stuck, and you start to see that the feedback loop weakens, negative feedback loop weakens, and you start to see the damage that really is involved with a whole bunch of different diseases. What actually happens is that the brain, under all that CRF, takes away more dopamine receptors, right? So we're right back in the same situation that we had with intoxication. And so if this person is in this hedonically compromised state, and maybe they're stressed because they're stressed, and they come across an intoxicant that for the first time in their life is able to push back against that, they're going to notice that. And I think this is the person who says, from the first time I took a drink, I knew I was an alcoholic, right? Or the antidepressant effect that opioids can have in a minority of people that you prescribe opioids for chronic pain, or for any kind of pain, right? And so when that surge comes along and it pushes back, not only does the drug have salience, it has utility. And it now becomes the main way that the person copes with all stress, right? So I think I'll just do a couple more slides and then stop. So the connection between childhood trauma and addiction is very strong. It makes basically every stage of addiction worse. It will decrease that person's initial motivation to quit. That's something that you have to take into account, because this person is not going to be as motivated quite as quickly as you'd like them to, and it increases their risk of relapse. And it's not just addiction. It turns out that these early adversity stressors, right, have a connection to not only addiction, but a wide range of chronic illnesses. And this is the connection between early adversity and poor health outcomes later in life. So I think I'll stop at this point. Kim, did you want to do part 2?